So I'm standing on the plains of Abraham, and if you can for a minute imagine Montcalm is fortified here, and he knows that this is the key to the Great Lakes. So Wolfe is en route, and Wolfe has 29 ships of the line, 22 frigates, 80 transport ships, and 55 smaller craft, a quarter of the British fleet. He's got ministers, surgeons, prostitutes, children, livestock. It's a floating city. And when Montcalm looks down the river, this flotilla spans 150 kilometers. And Montcalm knows that he has to defend this spot, because once this fails, the potential for losing the North American continent is real. The river is only a kilometer wide here, so it's narrowed down. We're 300 feet or so above the water, and this is a perfect place for a fort. And to Wolfe, it seems impenetrable. He can't figure out how he's going to do it. But Montcalm, he doesn't wait. Montcalm decides to take offensive action right off the bat. So he takes all the small boats he can get. They build rafts. They chain them all together. They put gun barrel or gunpowder on each of the devices, and they put a man on it. And the idea is they set them off into the current of the St. Lawrence. They would float down into the British fleet, and at the key moment they would ignite. The first ignition would signal the others to ignite the rafts, and they would burn the British fleet into the St. Lawrence River. Well, sadly, one of the French, I guess if you're French, sadly, one of the French fellows ignites his too soon, or accidentally, we'll never know. And that signals all the others to ignite them way too early. So basically the British get to enjoy some fireworks on the river. It does no damage at all. So now Wolfe takes defensive action, or offensive action. He goes down the river to Montmorency Falls, or Beauport, and Montcalm knows that through intel that's where Pitt, Wolfe's boss, has decided they'll attack and come at the fort from the east. Well, Montcalm is entrenched there. So Wolfe sends in 4,000 men. It's an abysmal failure. They're slaughtered. He retreats. He's pondering back in his base camp what to do next. When just over the hill from me, he finds a goat path. Now, the French had not really defended this area because they assumed that nobody's going to attempt to bring an army up this hill. Well, Wolfe does. That's his, he's running out of time. He knows that the St. Lawrence is going to freeze up, and he's going to have to limp back to England in disgrace. So on the night of September the 13th, he brings 500 men up this goat path, along with 2 cannon. And I'm going to take you down to the spot where he puts his men in line for battle. And it's a poor spot from a military point of view because it's the lowest spot. But he knows if he comes up onto the top of this hill, just over behind the redoubt here, that he's going to be within cannon fire of the fort. So he doesn't have much choice, and I'll show you where he assembled his men. So I'm pretty much up onto the plains, and when I say plains, it was basically an abandoned cornfield, and it didn't have these magnificent old growth trees. It was a bit of shrubbery here and there, but it is a long way down to the river from here. The hundreds of feet, in fact, and down below me is where Wolfe decides to put his men in line. Now, for the first time in military history, Wolfe varies from the three-man line because he simply doesn't have enough men. He's got 500 souls, so he puts them in 2 lines. But he orders his men to put double balls in each barrel. So he wants to have maximum firepower when it comes. And the main battle is going to take place sort of on this ridge, with the French up on the top coming down. And this looks good for Montcalm. I mean, from a military standpoint, he's got more men and he's got the high ground. The problem is he's got Canadian soldiers fighting with French soldiers, and they're not used to fighting together. And their line starts to go into disarray right off the start. And what happens is the center gets too far back, the left gets too far forward. The Canadian militia are taught to, when they fire, unlike the British, stand there and reload. They immediately flop to the ground and reload. Wolfe just lets them keep coming. And as they progress, they're getting even in more disarray, because Wolfe's brought 2 6-pound cannons up here, and he's causing all kinds of disarray with them. Wolfe waits, and as they get closer, he waits and he waits. Finally, a sharpshooter sees Wolfe, and he shoots him in the wrist. He's quickly bandaged. And when they're 40 to 50 yards from Wolfe, Wolfe raises his cane to give the order to fire. It's devastating. And it will be the last military order that General Wolfe ever gave. I'll take you up to where he actually died. Standing on the very spot where Wolfe falls. So after being wounded in the wrist, he takes a shot in the abdomen, a second shot in the chest, and he dies immediately, albeit a victorious death, because the French and Indian Wars aren't going very well for the British. Starting with George Washington at Fort Necessity, or the Great Meadows, then the Battle of the Monongahela, where Bradford is soundly defeated with the largest military group ever amassed in the North American continent. Finally, the British get a victory at Lake George, and I think to the credit of Sir William Johnson, who realizes the importance of allying with the natives. And it's so important as that spot, it's on the Mohawk River. They get control of the whole Mohawk Valley, that they start construction of Fort William Henry. If you've seen the movie The Last of the Mohicans, we know what happens there. It's not a very accurate portrayal of history, but Montcalm lays it under siege and takes the day there. So they need a victory, and Quebec City is the key, as I mentioned, to the Great Lakes, and take this spot and well, you win the day. And yeah, so I'm going to go up to where Montcalm passed. So I'm almost up to Montcalm's spot where he fell, and it's a long hill. It's, you know, you think about walking up it, but imagine fighting your way up it, and the mayhem when everyone was in the fray here. Montcalm made a couple of errors. So he knew Wolfe was desperate. The river was going to freeze up. He had to get out or win, and he knew there was going to be some kind of a brave assault, but he didn't anticipate this one. He thought he was going to retry to take Beauport. So that's where he was at the time of it. Now visualize soldiers that have been under bombardment for months. Lower Quebec City is almost totally destroyed. They're on half rations. They haven't slept all night. Montcalm quick marches them up, past the castle, or past the fortress, onto the Plains of Abraham in this general area where they started to form up. Had Montcalm not engaged the British, simply stayed in the fort, stayed at Beauport, he would have taken the day. There wouldn't have been a battle. Because we have another group of soldiers, 3,000 in number, that are en route from Montreal. However, they're going to arrive here after the battle's over, and by the time they get here, there's a British flag flying over Quebec. So up to Montcalm's grave. Sorry, not grave, where he passed. One last thing before I go up to where Montcalm fell. You think it's over here now, and the British flag is flying over the fort, but on April the 28th, 1760, General Lévis from Montreal marches his troops up here. They retake the fort. Now the British have been garrisoned, a very small garrison here over winter. They're half starved, their uniforms are rotting off them, and it now becomes a transatlantic race to see who will get resources here first. The French send 5 ships, 400 men. I believe the admiral of the French Navy made a comment because they were so engrossed with battle in Europe. He says, there's no sense trying to put the fire out in the stable when the house is on fire. So he doesn't send hardly anything. The British arrive with 22 ships, I believe, and hundreds of soldiers. And again, the British flag flies over it. So on that date, half the American continent changes hands to the British. Yeah, and King George II there, he in his benevolence decides to allow the French-speaking people to keep their language and to keep their religion, which is a big concession on his part. I think he thinks it's going to win over their favor, because in Europe, particularly in England, Catholics don't have much say in anything. They're viewed very poorly. So he now has 65,000 new patrons, if you would, and they're not overly happy. And to this very day, Canada remains a bilingual country. and I'm going to hone up on my French after this weekend because I miss a lot of the points. I don't know if they're talking about me or making jokes or talking history, and I want to hear their words on history. So let's go up and see where Montcalm fell. So I'm standing on the very spot that Montcalm receives his fatal wound. He's taken back to the General Hospital where he succumbs to those wounds. And reportedly just before his death, he's noted to say, "I'm not sad that I'm dying before I see the fall of Quebec." It's worth pointing out too that if you think about the American colonies, they're getting pretty tired with Britain at this time. This war is, one can arguably say that it's the lead up to the American Revolution. The French Canadians here, we're talking 5th generation, and they're not overly enamored with their mother country, France. So we've never had a rebellion up here, but it's just an interesting thing. And sadly, old Quebec City, which was down on the river, was totally destroyed by Wolfe. And we're not talking a crude little outpost anymore. We're talking, as I said, 5 generations. So we had architecture that would vie that of Europe, all gone. But one can say that this was the decisive, pivotal battle of the French and Indian Wars. And Britain now owns half the North American continent.